Hello bookworms, it's Jade from Bedtime Bookworm and welcome back to my channel. Today we're here to talk about my best and worst audiobooks that I listened to in 2019. This may or may not be my last video in my year wrap-up series for 2019. I did have a couple more ideas that I wanted to do, but as seems to happen every year, I feel like I'm running out of time because we're getting close to March. I do have a couple more series-related videos, and I wanted to do a video about like my past decade of reading, like a reflection on that. So I don't know, you may or may not be getting those videos. Let me know in the comment section if those are things that you're interested in. Anyways, let's get on to the audiobooks. I listened to a lot of audiobooks last year, 39 actually, but keep in mind that I like to pair audiobooks with books that I also have in other formats, so usually I'm reading in multiple formats. And because of that, I end up with a lot of audiobooks. I really love audiobooks as a medium for reading. I get a lot more read because I incorporate audiobooks into my routine. And sometimes the audiobook really enhances my experience with a book, which is the case for all of the best audiobooks that I'm including in this video. But first, I want to start with my worst audiobooks of the year because I only have 3 of them. And basically what I mean by worst audiobook is just that it's not an audiobook that I recommend. Like, I would recommend picking up the physical book over the audiobook for various reasons. So the first one on my list is The Priority of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon, which might be a big surprise to you guys because it was one of my favorite books from last year. But it wasn't one of my favorite books because of the audiobook. While I loved that book, I had a really hard time with the audiobook. I just found myself not really internalizing what the audiobook was saying. It was like going in one ear and out the other. I just couldn't retain the story. And I found myself rereading a lot of what I'd already listened to so that I could make sure I was putting all the pieces together, which of course ended up feeling like a bit of a waste of time. So I ended up not continuing on in the audiobook. I listened to like 20% of it before deciding that it wasn't going to improve. And so I stopped listening to the audiobook. This book is narrated by Leah Summers, who is a narrator that I hadn't listened to before. And I can't really pinpoint what it is about the audiobook that made me not be able to retain the story. It could have been maybe the accent that she was using. I do find sometimes when there is an accent, it's like an extra step my brain has to do to interpret the story or to like retain the story, and sometimes it just doesn't work for me. So I'm not sure if that was the case because I didn't really think she had like a really strong accent, but for whatever reason I just could not internalize the story as it was being read to me. Obviously that could be a very personal experience with this audiobook, so take that with a grain of salt. But I definitely do still recommend reading this book because I love it. Next on my worst audiobooks list, I have Recursion by Blake Crouch, which again was another one of my favorite books from last year. I did listen to the entirety of this one on audiobook. It's narrated by John Lindstrom, who I had previously listened to narrate Dark Matter and I loved. So he's definitely a narrator that I enjoy listening from. And the female voice was Abby Craden, who I don't think I've listened to before. But regardless, my issue with this audiobook is not with the narrators. Instead, it's with like the format of the book. So because of the way this book is written, there are multiple timelines and you kind of jump back and forth between the perspectives that are set at a different time. And because of that, I find listening to the audiobook to be confusing because you have to really pay attention to what date is read at the beginning of like a chapter or a section, and it's easy to forget that sometimes. So for pretty much any book that has some sort of like time jumping back and forth, I don't usually recommend the audiobook because it can just be a little more confusing. And then along those lines, I also have The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle by Stuart Turton. Now this one is a book that made it to my worst books of the year, but that is unrelated to the audiobook issue that I had. This is another book where there is jumping around in timelines a little bit, and it can be a little confusing when listening to it on audiobook. I was really glad I had a physical copy to refer to when I got confused. This one is narrated by James Cameron Stewart, who is a narrator I've never listened to before, and I don't remember having any specific issues with the way it was narrated. It was more just the format of the book is why I don't recommend the audiobook. Okay, moving on to best audiobooks of the year. This is kind of a long list. I had a really hard time shortening it. I did remove some things that I had originally put on here, but basically I was trying to come up with a list of audiobooks where I think that the audiobook enhanced my experience of reading that book, and that I would recommend, if you are someone who likes audiobooks, that you choose to listen to these books over just read them physically. So of course I had to start the list off with the Wheel of Time books by Robert Jordan, and also some by Brandon Sanderson. I read like 4 or 5 Wheel of Time books last year as I was finishing out the series. These are narrated by Michael Kramer and Kate Redding, who are 2 of my favorite narrators, primarily because of this series. I definitely recommend listening to the audiobooks for this, although I hesitate to recommend them for your first read because I think sometimes it can be hard to remember all of the characters and who everyone is. But definitely for rereads, they're great, and obviously people do still listen to them on their first read and enjoy them. Last year I also read or listened to Muse of Nightmares by Laini Taylor, which is the second book in the Strange the Dreamer series, and I did actually listen to Strange the Dreamer as a reread later on in the year too. But either way, these are narrated by Steve West. He is one of my all-time favorite narrators, and anytime I see a book is narrated by him, I want to listen to it over just reading it. I also read some Farseer books last year, which is the first trilogy in Robin Hobb's Realm of the Elderlings. I think I read the second and third books last year. Either way, I listened to all of them. They're narrated by Paul Bomer. I definitely think he does a really good job with the narration, and that listening to these books enhanced my experience of reading them. So if you're going to check out the Farseer trilogy, I definitely recommend the audiobooks. I would also recommend listening to Nosferatu by Joe Hill. As you guys know, this was one of my favorite books of last year, and I think part of that definitely had to do with the fact that I love the audiobook so much. The audiobook is narrated by Kate Mulgrew, who is an actress, and she just did such an amazing job with the different voices in this book. The main villain in this book, Charlie Manx, she gives him such a creepy voice. I didn't actually start out listening to this book on audio because I think it wasn't quite available to me or something, or I was reading it physically and then I had access to the audiobook, so about like 30-40% in, I picked up the audiobook, and I totally regretted not listening to the audiobook from the start because Kate Mulgrew is amazing, and I wish I had listened to the whole thing on audio. Like I said, I definitely think the audiobook enhanced my experience of this book, so if you're going to pick up Nosferatu, definitely consider picking it up on audio. I also listened to The Book Thief last year, and this one is narrated by Alan Corduner, who I've heard about, but I don't think I actually have listened to any of his books previously. Going into this one, I definitely heard that the audiobook was the way to go, and I kind of agree. Alan Corduner definitely did an amazing job with this one. I only hesitate a little bit because the physical book did have some like formatting things that, you know, aren't apparent when you're just listening to it. So I personally really enjoyed flipping through or reading along in the physical book as I was listening. But I definitely agree that Alan Corduner does an amazing job with this audiobook, and if you're going to read The Book Thief, definitely consider picking it up on audio. Last year I also listened to Now I Rise by Kiersten White. It is the second book in the Conqueror saga. This one is narrated by one of my favorite female narrators, Fiona Hardingham. I think she just does such a great job like breathing life into these characters, and also this book has words in it that I'm not familiar with that I was definitely saying incorrectly or like pronouncing incorrectly in my head that she pronounced correctly, or at least I'm assuming correctly. She's definitely a narrator that I enjoy, and anytime I see her name attached to an audiobook, I try to pick it up. There was also Pet Sematary by Stephen King. This one is narrated by Michael C. Hall, who I know from Dexter. Being another actor, he just does such a great job with the narration and giving people different voices. I was totally sucked into the audiobook for this, and I really think that I enjoyed it more because I listened to it than I would have if I had just been physically reading it. I definitely want to read or listen to more books narrated by Michael C. Hall in the future. Next on my list, I have The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. This is the first book in the First Law trilogy, and this series is narrated by Stephen Pacey. I had heard that the audiobook for this series was good and that the narrator was good, which is why I picked it up on audiobook, but it still blew me away with how great of a narrator Stephen Pacey is. There's a specific character in this series who is missing a bunch of his teeth, and so he talks with a lisp sometimes, and the narrator did that lisp so well. But also, whenever this character is having an internal monologue, he made sure not to use the lisp. Like, it's only present when he's physically talking out loud, and I just thought that was such a realistic touch, and I loved it. I love these books on audiobook so much that I actually bought the second and third book in the series on audiobook because the audiobooks weren't accessible to me through my library or through Scribd or anything. So if I wanted to listen to them on audiobook, I needed to purchase them myself, and so that's what I did because I love the way he narrated the first book so much. Next, I have the Illuminae Files, which I listened to the second and third books in that series last year. These I can't talk about necessarily a specific narrator because it's a cast of narrators. I know in one of them, like I think it was Gemina, Steve West is one of the many narrators. I looked through the names a little bit before I sat down to film this, and I didn't really recognize anybody else's name, but I really enjoyed my audiobook experience of these books. I know I've talked about this before, but the audiobooks are such a great experience when it comes to this series. I had only read and not listened to the first book in the series, and then these last two I listened to and I read along, and I love them more than I did the first book, so I really think that the audiobooks helped to enhance my experience a little bit, just to bring the characters to life a little bit, because in the first book I had trouble connecting with the characters and with some of their like banter, but listening to those things in the second and third books was such a different experience. This is another couple of books where the formatting of the physical books is really interesting, and so it's another one that I would recommend trying to do both together if you can. I really enjoyed listening to it while flipping through the book and reading along. Next, I have The Loneliest Girl in the Universe by Lauren James, which was another one of my favorite books from last year. This one is narrated by Lauren Ezzo, who is someone I was not familiar with. I just remember I could not stop listening to this book. Part of it was the story, but also because the narrator was doing such a great job telling me the story. I specifically remember towards the end of the book where things were getting really intense, and I could just feel the tension through the audiobook. I definitely think that the audiobook helped to enhance my reading experience of this book, and that's why I would recommend listening to it if you can. Then I have another one of my favorite books from last year, And the Trees Crept In by Dawn Kurtagich. This one is narrated by Polly Lee, who I had listened to before and really enjoyed. She's definitely one of my favorite narrators, and when I see her name attached to an audiobook, I add it to my list of audiobooks that I want to listen to. So going into this, I already knew that I liked the narrator, but she still totally blew me away with this book. She did such an amazing job. So in this book, it is a YA horror book. There's a lot of creepy things that happen, and the creepy voices that Polly Lee used were amazing. And then on top of that, it wasn't just like Polly Lee reading the book to me. This was so much more of a production than just that. There are like sound effects and layering of audio, so you can hear like creaking noises or like the wind blowing. And there are also parts where you can hear like whispering in the background, and it was so good. I definitely recommend listening to this book on audio because it is just such a fantastic production, but I do have two hesitations about that. One, this is another book that has some interesting formatting things going on, so it's worth taking a peek at, but if you were going to have to pick between the two, I would definitely recommend the audiobook more than the physical book. My other hesitation is if you kind of get scared easily, I wouldn't recommend listening to the audiobook. I definitely think the audiobook enhanced the creepiness of this book, and that's one of the things that I loved about it. But if you're not someone who enjoys that kind of reading experience, then maybe don't listen to the audiobook. All right, and then the last audiobook or narrator that I'm gonna recommend to you based on what I listened to in 2019 is the Lightbringer series by Brent Weeks. I listened to 3 books in the Lightbringer series last year, and these are all narrated by Simon Vance. That's not a narrator I had been familiar with before, but I think he does a really good job bringing these characters to life and just making the story more enjoyable than it would be if I wasn't listening to them. These books are really long, and I've definitely had my struggles with them. They're books that I enjoy some things about and don't enjoy some other things about, but listening to the audiobook really helped me to get through the books, especially the second one is one that I really struggled with, and I'm so glad that I have the audiobooks to help me. I definitely think that I would enjoy these stories a little bit less if I wasn't listening to them. Alright guys, those are all of my best and worst audiobooks from 2019. If you have listened to any of these books, let me know what you thought of them down in the comment section, or let me know what some of your best and worst audiobooks of 2019 were so that I know what other books I need to check out on audio or avoid on audio. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more bookish content. That is all I have for now. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bookworms, keep reading. Bye.